my dad came back from Vietnam in 1968, which is where we kind of got that insight into the fact that people were starting to really talk about the war, because my dad was drafted rather than enlisted, so a lot of the drafted guys were starting to come back in 68 and talk about things that had happened over there, so it was changing perception of war. But lighter note, I didn't really realize that 68 through like early 70s were kind of the golden age of the muscle car, because they hadn't been kind of created before that, and then until like the mid 60s, but then there was the gas crisis in the early 70s, right? And so the muscle cars kind of fell out of favor because they were so expensive to drive because of how much gas they consumed. So for us, like picking 68 was kind of perfect for vehicles as well, because we have the kind of the old standards that you expect from the mob guys to be driving. You've got little sports cars, and you've got trucks and jeeps and other things that some military vehicles were starting to be driven on city streets or whatever. But then we also have all the muscle cars, which is kind of a really small window of time that those were popular.
Yeah, my grandmother had a really cool Ford Falcon, and my parents instead had a Dodge Aspen. We were doing 80s mob games in these horrific big station wagons that have no sexy appeal whatsoever.
We have station wagons.
So let's talk more about Lincoln Clay. When did you start to envision this character as the protagonist? I'd love to hear the process of how you kind of fleshed him out over time to make him a more complex character. Bill, do you want to start that?
Yeah, sure. It was kind of the Mafia franchise. One of the hallmarks of it is that we basically grabbed these kind of very specific time and places, and then, like Kate mentioned earlier, we kind of inserted a gifted anti-hero into that space. So when we started really thinking about Lincoln Clay, it kind of was simultaneous with both the year and also the setting. All three of those things kind of came up together. Like I said, one of the franchise pillars is capturing a moment in time and basically fully immersing the player in that. And it just really kind of made sense that the main character would be someone like Lincoln Clay, because this is a confluence of various things like Vietnam, it's also the South, he's a mixed race, and by having him be that way, it opens a window so that we can examine other aspects of him as a character.
I was about to say, this is probably something because we're so accustomed to it now, but being mixed race in 1968 was not common. I mean, Loving versus Virginia, which kind of ended, the laws prohibiting mixed race marriages. I don't even think that was on the books yet. I guess I hate to say it, what advantages does that give you with his character? Because he would be so distinct in that kind of place and setting.
Well, dramatically, it allows us to have a push and pull in terms of how he interacts not only with the other characters in the game, but also with the city and the world in general. And it also helps us inform a very kind of specific worldview in a certain degree. But it's just also, like I said before, it's just a dramatic window that kind of helps define and kind of place the game in New Bordeaux.
Well, also, it kind of means he really doesn't fit in anywhere, which is a big part of his character, from the fact that he's an orphan to this, nowhere where he goes does he just easily fit in, and that's a big part of his personality as well.
Yeah, and I think the last thing I would say is, when we talk about him being a gifted anti-hero, there's kind of two things that we always focus on. One is obviously his training as a soldier, which allows him to take on the mob and kind of take out these like mob bullies essentially that have greater numbers but don't have the advantage of kind of his tactical thinking or his military training. But the other one, which I think does come from his background of being an orphan and having to survive in an orphanage and having to survive on the streets and being part of some gangs and being mixed race, is his ability to bring together disparate characters, disparate people, kind of under a common banner and a common cause. So throughout the game, he recruits a number of people to help him in his cause, and he's able to do that because he's got kind of a more well-rounded worldly movie than some of the other folks that don't have the same background.
I mean, yes. Lincoln clearly has a chip on his shoulder, but in an odd way, he's also a really strong manager. Where that's one way that you can kind of play the character, because he's bringing different people that they're not organizing themselves in a criminal way around ethnicity. They seem to be organizing themselves just because they seem to have a common goal. I mean, it's a very interesting way of approaching this. I'd love to sort of hear more about that.
Well, fictionally, we touched on a little bit that Lincoln served in Vietnam. One of the things he did while he was there, he was actually part of the special forces and loaned out to the CIA. And historically, the CIA ran secret bases out of Laos, and they would basically conduct guerrilla warfare against the NV and the NBA and the DC. And as a part of that, there is an element of recruiting, the enemy of my enemy suddenly becomes my friend. So at least narratively within the game, that's something that is kind of centers him in terms of Hayden said, he was able to rally these other people around. Normally the three underbosses who ended up working for Lincoln, Cassandra, Vito, and Burke, they would never have anything to do with each other. But because of his past and kind of who he is, Lincoln is able to rally them together and point them in a single direction, which is going after Sal Marcano. And yeah, it just harkens back. Like he's kind of the odd man out, and you're kind of the odd man out. That's also a skill you can learn, but also as part of his training that he received when he was in Vietnam.
Now, without giving too much away, typically one doesn't just wake up in the morning and say, hey, I'm going to take on the law. It just doesn't work that way. So if you give a sense of what is kind of the motivation, he already has good reason to be angry, but within what makes him specifically angry at the existing organized crime in New Bordeaux?
So, obviously we touched on it in the trailer, but when Lincoln returns from Vietnam, let me back up a second. So, Lincoln originally is an orphan. He spends time in a Catholic orphanage. When the orphanage is shut down, he falls in with a black mobster named Sammy Robinson, who has a biological son named Ellis, and they essentially adopt Lincoln. Lincoln joins the Army, spends 4 years in Vietnam, and at the start of Mafia 3, Lincoln's just returned home. And his plan is to actually leave. He basically came back to say goodbye. But because of problems that Sam was having, Lincoln's kind of fatal flaws is loyalty, so he decides to stay and help out. Which unfortunately ends with the Italian Mafia, which in our version of New Orleans is led by a guy named Sal Marcano, betrays the black mob and kills everybody. And that really that's really the catalyst for what Lincoln does for the rest of the game, which is him exactly revenge on Sal. But it's a special type of revenge. He just doesn't go out. If he wanted to, he'd probably just go kill the guy. But as he says, that's not enough. He wants to systematically dismantle Sal Marcano's criminal organization and replace it with his own criminal organization.
I think I want to point out, and I wonder if you guys in the audience have noticed this, when you just sort of detail what we've been detailing here about the game and the characters in the game, it's something that I would probably hear more typically when someone's describing what you're working on. Or actually, a novel. I mean, it's fascinating just how much sort of research and thought has gone into this. And it sounds how intricate and nuanced the story is that you want to tell. Was that something that you saw at the beginning of development, or does it happen through the process? You got excited about the subject matter?
I've always been excited about the subject matter. Crime fiction is probably a tie with horror fiction as my favorite genre.